Oh, hi there, and welcome to my 10.1.5 Unholy Death Knight guide. This will be the last 1.5 guide, since on Wednesday we'll be going into 1.7. Let's get into it. The stat you want to look for on Unholy Death Knight really depends on whether you're focusing on your single target damage or your AoE damage. For single target, the generic stat priority is as follows. You want main stat, and then you want to focus on haste and mastery, followed by crit and versatility. Now, mastery, crit, versatility, and single target all have their own values, so you will have to sim. But generally, going for haste and mastery will be the biggest DPS increase you can see in single target. In AoE, things get slightly different because you want as much mastery as possible, followed by as much crit as possible, and then haste and versatility in that order. The reason for mastery being so much better in AoE is because a lot of our AoE damage comes from shadow damage. So the more targets we actually fight, the more mastery actually benefits us in the long run. Now, going over the class tree, there isn't a whole lot of power nodes. Most of your power comes from your spec tree. However, there are some notables that you always want to pick up for DPS increases. You always want to pick up Might of the Pharasian for the 2% additional strength, as well as Merciless Strikes for the additional crit chance. You always want to pick up this talent point so you can get more runic power from your auto attacks. You'll pick up Unholy Ground so you get haste while standing in your Death and Decay. You always want to pick up AoE Talents to increase your attack speed, which follows along with gaining more runic power. You always want to pick up Rune Mastery to increase our strength whenever we use a rune. And we want to use Unholy Bond to increase the effectiveness of our Fallen Crusader. You always pick up Empower Rune Weapon in every situation so far. And then the question between Abomination Limb and Soul Reaper depends on whether you're doing a raid encounter with a single target focus, or if you're doing AoE and M+, where Abomination Limb can be very, very handy. This can also be very handy in certain raid encounters. Defensively and utility-wise, Death Knights are very, very tanky. However, they lack a lot of mobility. Some of the notable defensive layers that you get as an Unholy Death Knight are Death Strike, which is just gonna heal you and increase the healing done depending on the amount of damage you've taken. You also get AMS, Anti-Magic Shell, which absorbs magic damage and grants you runic power. This can also be used to generate a lot of runic power when needed. You also gain a passive 20% stamina increase, and you gain access to Anti-Magic Zone, which can reduce spell damage taken by 20% for 8 seconds or until it absorbs its cap. It's very useful in a lot of raiding scenarios. The last node on Assimilation here grants you an additional 100 runic power based on the amount you absorb with your Anti-Magic Zone. You also gain access to Permafrost, which just grants you a slight absorb shield, and you pick up Icebound Fortitude as your big damage reduction. You can also pick up Unholy Endurance, which makes it so that our Lichborn ability lasts longer and also is a damage reduction for 15%. In this talent setup, we also get access to Blood Draw, where whenever we brought low, we drain health from every nearby enemy on a 2-minute cooldown. Utility-wise, Unholy DKs and DKs in general are kinda hard to balance because they have Death Grip. Death Grip can be hugely beneficial or be completely redundant. It all depends on the fight encounter you are in. However, having access to Anti-Magic Zone is great for raid utility. Now, going over our single target raid talent setup, we have a very strict focus that we want to do. Our main big things we want to pick up is Unholy Assault, Army of the Dead, Summon Gargoyle, and Apocalypse. Unholy Assault is amazing because it grants you 20% haste for 20 seconds, as well as applying 4 festering wounds, something we will get into when we talk about the core rotation. Army of the Dead is a powerful cooldown, which is why it's 8 minutes long. However, with the talent of Army of the Damned, you actually reduce the cooldown of Army of the Dead by 5 seconds every time you use a Death Coil. This makes it so that Army of the Dead is roughly on a 3-minute window, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, depending on every fight. Summon Gargoyle is our big 3-minute cooldown window. Basically, we want to make sure we use as many Death Coils as we can, or as much runic power as we can, during our Gargoyle windows, because that's where our majority of our damage will actually come from. Apocalypse is part of our base rotation and base damage profile, where we are bursting some of the wounds we have on our target and summoning ghouls up to the amount of wounds we've bursted. Similar to Assassination, Unholy Death Knights get access to a execute mechanic below 35% health, where most of our base abilities will deal 30% more damage. This also means that if we have our cooldowns during an execute phase, we have one of the hardest hitting execute phases in the entire game, alongside having one of the strongest openers in the game with Army of the Dead and being helped up by augmentation evokers and power infusions. But what about raid encounters where we have multiple targets we want to hit, stuff like Assault in Aberrus? Well, we basically swap out of all the Death Coil talents to pick up our Epidemic, Unholy Blight, and Defile. This version of the build is roughly 1% behind on single target. However, you gain access to AoE Dump, an AoE application of our disease, and Defile, which grants us 8% mastery throughout the most of the encounter. This makes it so that we can actually utilize a huge load of our AoE damage without sacrificing a lot of our single target when we're focusing on raid encounters. Now, going into the M+ build, it's not too far off of what our raiding AoE setup is. We do not focus solely on Gargoyle, simply because currently there are 2 M+ builds. However, for the majority of players, and the most popular one is without a doubt the Disease build. The Disease build is kind of interesting because it functions around having Plaguebringer up. So the idea is that you make it so all your diseases hit faster. You also make it so that diseased enemies take more damage per disease they are affected by. And with Super Strain, we apply all 3 diseases, both the Frost, Blood, and Unholy one. We also have Ebon Fever, which makes it so our Unholy disease deals more damage over time in half of the normal duration. So it's a lot more on the managing your diseases continuously rather than focusing on one big gargoyle. Now, the other M+ build is very similar to the Disease build. However, you're playing around Vile Contagion now. Basically, you build up wounds on one target and then spreading that to 7 other targets. You plop down your Defile and then you spam your Scourge Strike away until you burst all of the wounds. It might be effective in very big AoE packs and in very high keys where things live long enough. However, you are now playing into a 1.5 minute cooldown AoE window rather than a consistent AoE damage profile. I will let whichever build you want to play up to you, and they will all be linked in the description below. So when we're talking about the core rotation of playing an Unholy Death Knight, there's one important thing you need to learn how to manage, and that's your Festering Wound stacks. Festering Strike applies 2 to 3 wounds. Clawing Shadows or Scourge Strike will then burst a Festering Wound, applying the damage and generating us runic power. This runic power we will be spending on Death Coil in single target and Epidemic in AoE. The general rotation in a single target situation is you want to use Outbreak to keep on your virulent plagues. Then if the target is below 35% HP, you want to use Soul Reaper. Soul Reaper hits extremely hard and is part of our execute. Now, if you're above 3 or more Festering Wounds, that's when you want to use your Clawing Shadows or your Scourge Strike. Now this proc is basically just a free Death Coil, so we always want to make sure that we never overcap our runic power while we're just continuing slamming away. So this is your base priority, building up to above 3 Festering Wounds and making sure we never overcap on runic power with Death Coil. When you're below 2 wounds, that's when you want to use your Festering Strike to build up new wounds. The majority of your single target damage actually comes from your Death Coils and your base Clawing Shadows, outside of your execute. But yeah, that's actually your base rotation without using cooldowns. Our opener in single target as Unholy Death Knight is very scripted, and it's very important that we actually do it in the correct order to ensure maximum uptime. If you have the 4Ps of your Aberrus set bonus, it's quite important that we actually make sure we are in combat before we start with our Army of the Dead. So as you run in, you want to pop Army of the Dead, Outbreak, Festering Strike, Death and Decay, then we want to summon Gargoyle, Dark Transformation, Death Coil 3 times, Unholy Assault, Empower Rune Weapon, and Apocalypse. And at this point, we are basically just gonna follow our single target priority, making sure we don't overcap our runic power, making sure we have our dots fall off as well. Now, as you use your Unholy Assault, that is usually when you would use your Trinket and your Racial. You would also use your Potion on your Army of the Dead cooldown as you ran in. And now it's just back to your base single target rotation, where you're just managing your debuff, disease, manage your wounds, and if your target is low, use Soul Reaper. You probably need to practice your opener a few times to get it fully right, but when you get it fully right, you will see a huge spike in your opening burst. Now, the reason why our opener is as strong as it is because we have all of these haste benefits like Unholy Assault, Empowering Rune Weapon, all feeding into our Gargoyle and into all of our other minions, including our regular minion, my lovely Pebble Basher here, as well as all of our Apocalypse minions. And this is also why Unholy DKs are one of the best recipients for Augmentation Evokers and Power Infusion, because you're not only buffing up the Unholy DK, you're also buffing up all of their minions, which is a huge proponent of their damage. In a raid cleave situation, which I will just explain with the talents here, you're basically going to focus on your single target. However, you want to utilize your defile windows as much as possible. This means that, in theory, if there are 3 or more enemies during your defile windows, you want to just spam your Scourge Strike or your Flowing Shadows while you're in your defile due to cleaving strikes. If there are only 2 targets, just want to make sure that you're keeping up your wounds on your main target and focus on your single target and just passively cleave away with Scourge Strike in your defile. At 2 targets, you want to prioritize Death Coil. At 3+, you want to prioritize Epidemic. For demonstration purposes, I will show you the M+ rotation for the Disease build. The idea is honestly quite simple. You want to use Defile as you run in, Scourge Strike, and plop your Unholy Blight, and then spam your Epidemic windows, and basically just use all your cooldowns as much as you can while making sure that you have your defiles out, and spam away. Make sure you don't overcap while you're using your Epidemic and stuff. And then you want to make sure that you keep up your Plaguebringer, because this is actually quite a substantial amount of your AoE damage. In your defile windows, you want to just spam your Scourge Strike and Epidemics, making sure we do not lose our disease uptime, and just make sure that you keep Plaguebringer up 100% of the time. You can see I have mine tracked right here. That's actually your base AoE rotation. You defile as you run in, your Scourge Strike to start your Plaguebringer windows, and then use Unholy Blight or Outbreak to keep up your diseases. Then pop your cooldowns, go ham, and just get as many epidemics out as you can. And then in your defile windows, Scourge Strike to generate a whole lot of runic power, so you can use more epidemics. But yeah, I think that was all there is to discuss about Unholy Death Knight. It's rather simple once you get into the flow of it, but it's hugely rewarding when you play it right. Hopefully you'll subscribe for the 1.7 guides that will be coming out starting Wednesday. And until then, see you around. Bye!